Hello all, this is the Owl, and as requested by patron Cheddar, today we'll be going back in time, way back to the 70s actually, and looking at one of the most iconic and yet mostly forgotten dark manga of all time. It's difficult to overemphasize how influential Violence Jack was, not just on the post-apocalyptic genre, but, well, all modern manga, as well as, according to rumor, a surprising bit of Western media too, penned by the absolutely legendary Nagai. No, I'm not even slightly kidding. This guy is, among other things, basically responsible for making Shonen Jump a household name, in a large part being the pioneer of modern mainstream manga, as well as career mangaka as we know them today, and literally creating the modern incarnations of several popular genres of manga and anime, from giant robot mecha with Mazinger, ecchi comedy with Harenchi Gakuen, and the magical girl genre with Cutie Honey, as well as, honestly, likely what we call seinen today whole cloth. Yeah, influential doesn't actually begin to cover it. See, before his arrival, manga was almost entirely, well, sterile. G-rated, aiming to be as bland and as family-friendly as possible, with stuff like Astro Boy being the norm. Nagai was, well, not that, and this may have something to do with his history. Nagai as an individual is also pretty fascinating. According to what we know, he was interested in being a manga creator from a pretty young age, and while the rest of his family was at least vaguely supportive, his mother was so heavily against this that she, and again this is all anecdotal, would go out of her way to contact publishers to directly sabotage his efforts at being recruited. And this would likely have been the end of Nagai, except for a man now somewhat obscure, Shotaro Ishinomori, who, among other things, created Super Sentai, which you might know as Power Rangers, deciding to mentor the young creative. However, it quickly became obvious that Nagai wanted to do something different. He wanted to push boundaries, to shock, to upset, to challenge and subvert societal norms, to critique Japanese society and values, and dramatically change what could or couldn't be shown in a manga. His work was going to be raunchy, gory, frightening, challenging, and, not infrequently, unapologetically dark. And this led to him becoming insanely controversial for his time, branded a literal enemy of society in the incredibly conservative Japan of the 60s and 70s. And this, likely thanks to the Streisand effect, helped to catapult him both into notoriety and massive success, creating, well, at least in part, a new type of manga, shonen, aka manga made specifically for and marketed towards older teenage boys. And this would later divide somewhat more officially into what we think of today in terms of shonen being marketed to younger teenage boys and seinen being marketed to older kids and adults. And yes, this divide could be a video of its own. It's really interesting. If you want to credit someone for the author and some would say auteur-driven, often dark, and mostly self-contained shonen and seinen of today, it's almost certainly Nagai. And Violence Jack is a very odd animal even for a Nagai manga. It's essentially a sequel, or at least a spiritual successor, to another of Nagai's hits, Devilman. Yes, that Devilman, and is credited by many as having created the post-apocalyptic genre as we know it today, inspiring famous manga and anime like Hokuto no Ken and Akira, later classics like Berserk, an enormous body of Kazuo Umezu's work, but particularly The Drifting Classroom, as well as a bunch of Western media, such as that one Batman story that basically every single Batman movie and show attempts to adapt, as well as, allegedly, frigging Mad Max. Oh, and some scenes from 300, and allegedly even some bits from Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings, although I cannot stress this enough, rumors. Oh, and bizarrely enough, he also had a museum dedicated to him and his work, which burned down in the 2024 Sea of Japan earthquake, which, okay, as you will see soon, there is a strange irony here. However, covering Violence Jack is challenging. Its publication history, for one, is a huge mess, being spread around a ton of volumes, publishers, eras, sagas, reworkings, remasters, adaptations, and OVAs. And while there are collected editions in Japanese, these are really hard to come by in digital form, and as far as I know, have never received an official translation into English, and while there are some fan translations out there, they are A, incomplete, and B, kind of janky. And yeah, this makes doing a video rather tricky. At one point, I was actually going to bite the bullet, try and get a hold of the Japanese raws, but I should have figured out that the combination of their age and the lack of furigana made them well outside mine and Mrs. Owl's expertise in terms of Japanese translation. Hell, even the narrative is a pain, because this isn't even one story. It's several, bouncing around chronologically, sometimes merging, not only with other Violence Jack sagas and arcs, but also Devilman and frigging Cutie Honey. Oh yeah, and by the end, the story goes so completely howling at the moon insane that it makes Magical Girl Apocalypse... okay, bad example, but I'm not kidding, this stuff is bananas. So, what this means is that we will not be doing a proper deep dive here. Although, as with nearly everything else I cover, if there is sufficient interest, I would definitely attempt it. What we're going to do is to go through the first arc, take a look at some of the latest stuff in passing, and that'll probably be it. If you do want to read this yourselves, I would strongly recommend emailing Viz and Co, as there are complete versions out there in Italian and apparently in Spanish, so it's not like it's impossible to do. So, how does Violence Jack hold up? Is it as controversial as it's supposed to be? Has it aged like wine or more like milk? Let's take a look. Our story opens with an absolutely colossal earthquake hitting the Kanto region of Japan, resulting in widespread, cascading disasters such as enormous crevasses, tsunamis, floods, landslides, and volcanic eruptions, which wipe out nearly everyone in the region. Most of the arcs, as you'll see, start with a loose retelling of the earthquake and how our main characters of that arc wound up, well, how they are in the aftermath, whether it be a quest for vengeance or simply trying to survive. All you need to know at this point is that the entire Kanto region became an isolated, lawless, post-apocalyptic no man's land. We start off by zooming in on a group of youths, constantly preyed on by other gangs. We'll get to know more about them later on, but what is interesting to note at this point is that Nagai's art is just fascinating, operating as an intermediate step between classic Tezuka-esque art, who was also apparently one of his mentors, and yeah, that's like learning that Richard Goldwater mentored Garth Ennis, there's a deep cut for you, and the more high contrast, detailed, and deep blacks look of Umezu. We then go back further in time and meet our protagonist for the first arc, which will also establish our initial pattern. We'll meet someone before and during the quake, then we'll see them in Kanto after as they get caught up in something nasty, run into Violence Jack, and from there the story will disintegrate into a tidal wave of blood, guts, death, squick, rape, and genitalia. Seriously, once we pass the halfway point, this series is just wall-to-wall boobs and dongs. Again, think more seinen than shonen. Our first protagonist is Ryu Takuma, a serious and diligent young man who lives with his younger brother and older sister Yuri, who's a good sort. And yeah, anyone with an eye for narrative causality knows that Yuri might as well be called I am going to die in a tragic fashion. As expected, the earthquake happens, telegraphed by a scene that almost certainly inspired Gyo, as animals begin acting weird. The earthquake itself hits while Takuma is at school, and while nearly everyone else dies, he basically lucks out and survives. Now, without going too much into detail, as this is a sensitive issue, especially right now, earthquakes in Japan are kind of their own thing, with most regions getting at least 1 or 2 decent shakers a year, and some of these are outright alarming, especially when you're a newcomer to Japan. However, after a while, you'll realize that it's as much a part of the culture as karaoke and high-functioning alcoholism. In all seriousness though, buildings are built either sturdy or flexible enough to weather these, and for the most part, no one really worries too much. And yet, earthquakes and the fear of them do seem to loom large in the collective Japanese unconscious. Just think of how many earthquake power sets there are and how powerful these tend to be. Ditto volcanoes, I guess. Anyway. Oh, right. Speaking of sensitive issues, while the gore in this thing is nothing to write home about yet, it gets way more explicit as the manga goes on. And I'm going to have to be careful with the content here, as a lot of it is, well, kids dying, kids killing people, kids killing kids, and a fair amount of rape, torture, and general squick. That, again, amps up to an absurd degree in the latter half of the series. Yeah, I cannot imagine why this would be controversial in 1970s Japan. Anyway, Takuma's family is soon confirmed dead aside from his sister, who he rushes off in search of, nearly dying due to a car exploding, but Yuri appears to save him at the last second. They then join up with some other survivors heading to a park, but when they arrive, they realize that no help is coming, and that if they don't escape Kanto, the spreading and widening chasms are going to trap them there. And thus, the survivors push onwards, slowly but surely becoming more animalistic and desperate, signaling the complete and utter societal breakdown to come. And then, of course, the volcanoes begin erupting, and in the first truly stomach-churning moment of the manga, Yuri is pierced by a volcanic shrapnel while defending Takuma, which basically roasts her from the inside out before immolating her, and we then get a time-lapse showing Takuma growing up, at least somewhat, in the wasteland. And this ends the preamble. Back in the present, we see the group of kids preparing to go full Stephen King to defend their food from a gang of bullies But while they do their best to recreate the apocalyptic rock fight, they get absolutely trounced and have the ever-loving hell beaten out of them, including some very young children getting nearly beaten to death, which, honestly, even if YouTube wasn't increasingly intense about this sort of stuff, even censored, I'll probably spare you. However, before things can get even worse, Violence Jack himself appears, and if you've ever seen or read this kind of manga, or frankly media before, you know there's only one way this ends. Jack joins up with the kids for some reason, in a sequence that might be a reference to Lone Wolf and Cub of all things, and to get everyone food, Jack takes some of the kids to a large nearby settlement called Slum Town, a violent, lawless place run by a collection of former gangsters and way worse. Yeah, I can see why people think this might have inspired Mad Max. Jack takes the kids to a fancy restaurant, but refuses to pay anything, resulting in a lethal confrontation between him, the kids, and a bunch of local enforcers. And we finally get to see Jack's namesake, an enormous jackknife that, without a doubt, inspired a rather iconic bit from Berserk. Seriously, the prose is almost identical, and we see that Jack isn't just strong, he's straight up superhuman. With the town enforcers dead or unconscious, Jack and the boys leave. And yeah, this is where the story starts turning into basically, well, not to put too fine a point on it, Frank Miller's 300. You'll see what I mean. Later, Takuma confronts Jack and, okay, this is a bit complicated. There's a myth about Jack that when he appears, he brings out the violence in others, and Takuma gets on his case about starting a completely unnecessary fight at the restaurant that resulted not only in deaths, but several of the kids murdering people. Yeah, I can't imagine why this would be controversial in... Wait, did I do this bit already? Regardless, this is almost certainly a nod towards a common at the time and commonly leveled at Nagai criticism of the time, and let's be honest here, still not uncommon perspective and worry in Japan regarding violent, sexy, or contentious comics, warping the minds of children and making them hate Japanese society. Sort of what happened in the West in regards to comics, albeit somewhat earlier. This is, however, where we learn about the character known as Slum King, who, spoilers, will be our primary antagonist in the manga, and I'm not even going to go into how utterly bonkers his origin story or his true nature are. Takuma takes Jack back to Slum Town in secret to see King for himself, and be warned, this is where the story starts to get a bit, well, icky. First up, we meet the Slum Queens, the Slum King's harem, as well as his close protection squad. Oh, and some of them are psychic, and also ninjas, just roll with it. Then, we meet the infamous dog people. Yep, that thing more than one of you brought up when I said I'd be covering this. As, allegedly, and I was unaware of this, bloody hell Japan, this apparently created an actual fetish in hentai that still exists today. And secondly, without too many spoilers, the male dog person is going to turn out to be a stupidly important character later in a fashion that is just so over the horizon insane that I cannot possibly do it justice. And yeah, this is still the era where I guess you could show T and A and a good amount of D in a shonen manga before the seinen classification was really a thing, but again, this is a very complicated topic that doesn't map perfectly onto what you likely think of as age ratings, and has more to do with the publisher and the target demographic. Remember, this was a shonen, and those of you who have read Gantz, yeah, it's pretty nuts. Sure enough, we meet King, dressed as a samurai. He has superhumanly strong muscles that, get this, allow him to wear ridiculously and comically tough armor that is required for him to live, as his muscles are so strong that, if he didn't have it on, they would crush his organs. There's a bit more to it than that, but I'm not going to spoil it as it's one of the manga's most gruesome and icky revelations. He also carries a seriously badass odachi, which, believe it or not, was real, albeit rarely used, essentially an extremely heavy, two-handed katana used primarily for dealing with cavalry. Regardless, King has his queens wipe out the remaining enforcers as punishment, and Takuma overhears that King is going to send a large group of fighters, known as the Heretics, to wipe out the youths in the hills as a reprisal, which upsets him more. After Takuma returns and is very nearly murdered by the other kids for starting all of this, he manages to narrowly talk them around to fighting with Jack's help. And yeah, this is where the manga becomes a siege battle, and anyone who knows me knows how much I love my siege battles. Meanwhile, the Heretics' leader is psyching up his 100-odd fighters, who are understandably a little bit reluctant, saying that if they kill Jack, they themselves will become legends. However, one of his queens gives King a psychic warning. She's had a vision that if he messes with Jack, it's going to result in all sorts of bad stuff happening. However, she cannot be more specific. Oh yeah, Jack apparently has supernatural abilities, although these are poorly defined, one of which seems to be that he's very difficult to accurately prophesy about. Regardless, as expected, the battle with the Heretics is a complete bloodbath, including a segment where they, I'm not kidding here, straight up execute a bound kid to bait the other kids out. Bloody hell. And we also get an indication that there may well be, as mentioned, some supernatural shenanigans afoot, as Jack seems to be able to straight up summon earthquakes, allowing him to rush their machine gun emplacement. The kids also account well for themselves in the battle, wiping out a good few heretics with their makeshift weapons, although plenty of kids die too. No, there's no way in hell I'm showing that on YouTube. Takuma also seriously grows a pair, taking out the Yakuza leader himself. Jack goes up against Slum King directly and actually comes pretty close to beating him, but leaves him alive for some bloody reason. Yes, this will be at least partially explained later on, but once again, it's so insane that the answer for now might as well just be because. This results in King calling in his elite forces, the Dragon, and yeah, this is the bit that I am absolutely convinced inspired one specific sequence of 300. Not just the dragon themselves, but the way the kids topple a huge wall over them, wiping a lot of them out and forcing them to retreat. King, rather than risk this story spreading and fomenting revolution, instead decides to leave the kids alone and instead commit to killing Jack at a place called El Dorado. But that's a ways away in the story, and we will not be tackling that today. From here, the narrative kind of wobbles around a bit, we meet some new characters in mostly disconnected arcs, until the various plot threads start coming together later on, with Slum King returning. Then we go off into the wibbly-woos for a good while, before we arrive at the final bit, and again, that has to be seen to be believed. Without too many spoilers, remember when I said that Violence Jack is a Devilman sequel? I was not kidding. So yeah, that's just a taster of this story. And while it definitely has problems and is very much a product of its time, there's still a lot to like here. And yet again, it's difficult to articulate how influential this was on manga, as well as anime to come, as well as a fair bit of Western media. This was one of the first truly realized, grungy post-apocalyptic battle stories, and, to my mind, the first to be done visually. Without Violence Jack, we wouldn't have Berserk, or a lot of your other favorites, and manga as a whole would probably still look more like this than like this. On the other hand, the fact that it's so damn hard to track down even fanlations of this thing in any sort of complete form is a turnoff. Seriously, for such an important series, you really can't give us an official release, viz. Although, due to the sheer amount of rape, torture, dead kids, and frankly worse stuff, maybe it's just a bit touchy. Anyways, before we finish for the day, I want to give a huge thanks, as always, to my fantastic patrons. Cheddar, Piece of Yeast, Elspresso, Cheerful Satanist, Starwin Marwin, Question Man 6, Kel Core, Jacob Ramsey, Crazy, Opinion Custard, Wargle, Hunting for R2D2, Inukia Koji, Rose Montgomery, Lance Goebel, Rafferty, Erin Arnold, The Hedgehog Gamer, Simone, Cobalt Worm, B Empress, Jake, Ranger Danger, Lucian, and Cheshire Quill. If you want to see more like this, why not stick around? Subscribe, bell, you know the drill. All that good YouTube stuff. If you want to hear me say your name, get early access to most of my videos, have some fun perks on the Discord, and, you know, help keep Baby Owl fed, and ensure that we can keep doing what we do, why not take a look at our Patreon? If you want to chit-chat about, well, nearly anything, drop by our Discord, some truly great people over there. Take care, my friends, and cheers. This is the Owl, signing off.